What's up, everyone? Hope everybody's having a great day. Today, we need to talk about one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the Greg Biffle tragedy. A young man who should be studying for finals right now, who should be planning his aviation career, who should be home for the holidays with his family. Instead, Jack Dutton is gone. 26 years old, a junior at Auburn University's professional flight program, a kid who loved aviation just like his dad. And on December 18th, he found himself in the right seat of a Citation jet he wasn't qualified to fly, making emergency radio calls he shouldn't have had to make, trying to help save 7 lives, including his own. This is Jack's story, the aviation student who died doing everything he could to help. The son who wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. The young pilot who ended up being the voice of a doomed aircraft in its final moments. Jack Dutton wasn't supposed to be making those radio calls. Let me be clear about that from the start. According to FAA records, Jack held a private pilot certificate with single-engine land privileges. He'd recently added an instrument rating, which shows he was serious about aviation. He was progressing through Auburn's professional flight program, but he had no multi-engine rating, no turbine experience, no citation-type rating. By every regulation and standard, Jack was a passenger in that citation. But when you listen to the audio, when you hear his voice coming through those radios, you're hearing a young man thrust into an impossible situation, trying to help the only way he could. Auburn University's professional flight program is one of the most respected in the country. They've produced thousands of professional pilots who fly for airlines, corporate operations, military branches. It's a rigorous program that takes students from zero experience to commercial ready in 4 years. Jack was a junior, which means he was more than halfway through. He'd completed private pilot ground school, aerodynamics, navigation, meteorology. He'd logged probably 200 hours, maybe more. He'd learned to fly in Cessna 172s and Piper Seminoles. He was on track to graduate in 2026 and probably had airlines already looking at him. The pilot shortage means students like Jack get recruited early. He had his whole career ahead of him. But here's the thing about being an aviation student with a pilot father. Especially when that father is Dennis Dutton. Retired Delta captain with decades of experience, you grow up in aviation. You speak the language, you understand the procedures. You've probably been right seat in countless flights since you were a kid. Not logging time officially, but absorbing everything, learning by osmosis, developing that aviation mindset that can't be taught in a classroom. Jack probably knew more about flying than his certificates showed. He'd grown up listening to his dad's stories, sitting in cockpits, maybe even handling the controls unofficially. That knowledge, that familiarity, might explain why he ended up being the one on the radio that day. The father-son dynamic in that cockpit adds another layer of tragedy to this story. Dennis Dutton, 67 years old, thousands of hours retired from Delta after a distinguished career. Jack Dutton, 26 years old, following his father's path, dreaming of his own airline career. Can you imagine the pride Dennis must have felt having his son next to him? Can you imagine how Jack must have looked up to his father, the accomplished captain? They probably talked about this flight for weeks before. Dad and son flying together in a Citation. It should have been a perfect day, a memory to treasure. Instead, it became their last moments together. When something went wrong shortly after takeoff, the dynamics in that cockpit would have changed instantly. Dennis would have shifted into captain mode, decades of training taking over. And Jack, despite his limited qualifications, would have wanted to help. That's what you do in aviation. You help, you support, you do whatever you can. So when Dennis needed someone to handle the radios, Jack stepped up. It wasn't legal, he wasn't qualified, but in that moment, none of that mattered. They had an emergency, and everyone needed to contribute what they could. The audio recordings tell us so much about Jack's state of mind. 5 transmissions over approximately 8 minutes. His voice starting calm, professional even. We have an issue. Not panicked, not dramatic, just stating facts. This is a young man who'd been trained to communicate clearly in aviation, who understood radio discipline, who knew that clear communication could mean the difference between help arriving in time or not. But as the flight progressed, as the situation deteriorated, you can hear the stress building. Not panic, but tension. The weight of responsibility crushing down on someone who shouldn't have had to bear it. Think about what Jack was seeing and feeling in those moments. His father wrestling with the controls, the aircraft not responding normally, the altitude bleeding away, the runway getting closer, but not close enough. And through it all, he's trying to maintain composure on the radio, trying to give position reports, trying to sound professional. Because that's what pilots do. That's what his training taught him. That's what his father would expect. Even facing death, he was trying to be the pilot he'd trained to become. The phrase, "we're getting everything going, we're getting our gear down," stands out because it's not standard phraseology. You don't announce gear extension on the radio. That tells us Jack was overwhelmed. He was narrating actions rather than communicating strategically. He was a student pilot in a situation that would challenge even experienced aviators. He was doing his absolute best with limited tools in an impossible situation. And the fact that he managed to make 5 coherent transmissions while everything was falling apart around him shows remarkable composure for someone so young with so little experience. Auburn's aviation program emphasizes crew resource management from day one. They teach students that aviation is a team effort, that communication saves lives, that speaking up can prevent disasters. Jack had absorbed these lessons. When the emergency began, he didn't freeze. He didn't panic. He took on the role of communicator and executed it to the best of his ability. His instructors at Auburn would probably say he did exactly what they trained him to do: support the pilot in command, maintain communications, stay calm, help however you can. He just never should have had to do it in a citation running out of options at low altitude. The legal implications of Jack being in that right seat are complex and honestly irrelevant now. Part 91 regulations would have required him to have at minimum a multi-engine rating to be there legally. The insurance company probably required even more. But when Dennis needed help, when seconds counted, when every hand was needed, Jack was there. He wasn't legally qualified, but he was his father's son. He was an aviation student. He was someone who understood enough to help, even if he couldn't fully comprehend the aerodynamic trap they were falling into. What breaks my heart is thinking about Jack's final moments. This young man who loved aviation, who'd chosen to dedicate his life to flying, watching it all go wrong. Seeing his father, the hero he'd looked up to, unable to save them. Knowing enough to understand they were in serious trouble, but not having the experience or authority to change the outcome. Still trying to help. Still making those radio calls. Still doing his job, even though it wasn't really his job. That's courage. That's dedication. That's the aviation spirit that makes this community special. The other passengers in that aircraft probably had no idea how young and inexperienced the voice on the radio was. Greg Biffle probably assumed it was Dennis or another qualified pilot. Christina and the kids probably didn't even know there was a problem until the very end. But Jack knew. He could read the instruments. He could feel the unusual attitudes. He could hear the strain in his father's voice. He knew they were in trouble, and he kept working. Kept transmitting, kept trying to be part of the solution even though the problem was beyond anyone's ability to solve. Auburn University released a statement after the crash acknowledging Jack as one of their students. They talked about his passion for aviation, his dedication to his studies, his bright future that was cut short. But they couldn't capture who Jack really was. The kid who grew up around airplanes, who probably knew he wanted to be a pilot before he could even spell the word, who chose Auburn specifically for their aviation program, who was working hard to follow his father's footsteps into the airlines. That's a life path that requires dedication, discipline, and genuine love for flying. Jack had all of that. His classmates at Auburn have shared memories on social media, stories about Jack helping others with difficult subjects, about him staying late in the flight planning room, making sure everyone understood the material, about his excitement when he passed his instrument check ride. These glimpses show us a young man who wasn't just going through the motions. He was passionate about aviation. He was generous with his knowledge. He was the kind of student who makes programs like Auburn special, the kind who would have made an excellent professional pilot if he'd been given the chance. The recordings of Jack's voice have now been heard by thousands of people in the aviation community. Professional pilots have commented on how well he handled himself given the circumstances. Air traffic controllers have noted his clear diction and proper phraseology, at least initially. Flight instructors have said he did better than many certificated pilots would have in that situation. But none of that matters to his family. To them, he's not the young pilot who handled an emergency. He's just Jack, the son who's never coming home, the brother who won't be at Christmas, the student who won't graduate. What makes this even more tragic is that Jack was so close to achieving his dreams. Another year and a half at Auburn, and he would have had his commercial certificate, his multi-engine rating. His instrument rating was already done. Airlines were starting to hire pilots before they even graduated. He probably would have had a job lined up, maybe at Delta like his dad, maybe at Southwest or American. The regional airlines were offering huge signing bonuses. The major airlines were creating pathway programs. It was the perfect time to be a young pilot entering the industry. Jack had won the timing lottery. He just didn't live to collect. I keep thinking about that moment when Dennis and Jack would have discussed who would handle what during the emergency. Did Dennis ask Jack to take the radios? Did Jack volunteer? Was there even a discussion, or did training and instinct just take over? Dennis wrestling with the controls and Jack automatically picking up the communication duties. We'll never know exactly how that division of labor happened, but we know it did happen. And we know Jack executed his part with remarkable composure for someone thrust into a situation he'd only studied in textbooks. The age difference between Dennis and Jack, 67 and 26, tells its own story. Dennis at the end of a magnificent career, Jack at the beginning of what should have been his own journey. One generation of aviator preparing to pass the torch to the next. That's how it's supposed to work in aviation families. The parents fly for decades, then watch with pride as their children take to the skies. Dennis probably imagined watching Jack's first solo in a jet, his first type rating, his first airline job. Instead, they died together in a citation that neither of them should have been in under those circumstances. The Auburn aviation community has rallied around Jack's memory. They've set up a memorial fund in his name. They're planning to put his name on a plaque in the flight school. His fellow students wore memorial ribbons during their flights. Because that's what aviation families do. We remember our own. We honor those who died doing what they loved, even when what they loved killed them. Jack Dutton will forever be part of Auburn aviation history. The student who died trying to help. The young pilot who kept his composure when many would have frozen. There's been discussion about whether Jack should have been in that seat at all, whether Dennis should have let him be there, whether Greg should have insisted on 2 qualified pilots. But all of that misses the point. In aviation, we help each other. We support each other. When someone needs assistance, we provide it, regardless of certificates or ratings. Jack was there because his father needed him, because the Biffle family needed him, because in that moment, having someone, anyone, to help with radios was better than Dennis trying to do everything alone. The regulations say he shouldn't have been there, but humanity says he couldn't have been anywhere else. The radio degradation in Jack's final transmission is haunting when you understand what it means. The signal getting weaker as the aircraft descends, his voice fading as they drop below the radio horizon. The last words possibly cut off mid-sentence as the trees interrupt the signal. This young man trying to communicate until the very end, trying to give their position so rescue crews would know where to look, still thinking of others even as death approached. That's not something you can teach. That's character. That's courage. That's who Jack Dutton was in his final moments. What would Jack's career have looked like if December 18th had ended differently? He probably would have graduated Auburn in 2026 with his commercial certificate and flight instructor ratings. Maybe spent a year instructing to build hours. Then off to the regionals. Captain upgrade in 2 years with the current shortage. Major airline by 30. Captain at a major by 40. 30-plus year career flying the biggest, most advanced aircraft in the world. Retiring like his father, with thousands of hours and countless stories. That entire future destroyed in 10 minutes over Statesville, North Carolina. His professors at Auburn are probably asking themselves if they prepared him for this, if they taught him enough, if there was something more they could have done. The answer is no. You can't prepare a student pilot for being in a failing citation at low altitude. You can't teach someone with a single engine rating how to help manage a twin-jet emergency. You can't simulate the pressure of knowing 7 lives, including your father's, depend on your radio calls. Jack did remarkably well with the training he had, but he was simply too young, too inexperienced, too unqualified for the situation he found himself in. The last photo of Jack posted on social media shows him in his Auburn aviation shirt standing next to a Cessna 172. Big smile, bright eyes, the whole world ahead of him. He looked like thousands of other flight students, young, eager, ready to conquer the skies. Nobody looking at that photo would imagine he'd die in a citation, making emergency radio calls. Nobody would think this kid, excited about flying a 172, would end up as the voice of a doomed jet. But that's exactly what happened. And now that photo is all his friends have left, a reminder of dreams that won't be fulfilled. So when we talk about the Biffle tragedy, we need to remember Jack Dutton. Not as a statistic, not as an unqualified person in the wrong seat, but as a young man who loved aviation, who was working hard to follow his dreams, who stepped up when needed even though he wasn't prepared for what was needed, who kept his composure in an impossible situation, who died trying to help. Jack represents all the young aviators out there working toward their dreams. His death reminds us that aviation doesn't care about your dreams. It only cares about physics and procedures and preparation. To Jack's friends at Auburn, his flight instructors, his classmates, know that he represented your program well in those final moments. He communicated clearly. He stayed calm. He supported his crew. He did everything you taught him to do. The fact that it wasn't enough isn't a reflection on him or his training. It's a reflection on the impossible situation he found himself in. Jack Dutton died as a pilot, even if his certificates didn't say he was one yet. He died doing what pilots do, trying to help, trying to communicate, trying to save lives. Rest in peace, Jack Dutton, 26 years old, Auburn aviation student, son of Dennis. Voice of Citation November 257 Bravo Whiskey in its final moments. You deserved more time, more training, more flights, more life. But in the time you had, you showed us what courage looks like, what dedication means, what the aviation spirit is all about. Your voice on those recordings will teach future pilots about composure under pressure, about communication in crisis, about stepping up when needed. You may not have had the ratings, but in those final moments, you were every inch a pilot. The aviation community mourns your loss and honors your memory. Thank you all for watching. This story hits hard because Jack could be any of our kids, any student at any flight school, any young person following their aviation dreams. His death reminds us that those dreams come with risks, that training matters, that regulations exist for reasons, that sometimes being helpful isn't enough. Share your thoughts below, especially if you're a flight student or instructor. Remember Jack Dutton not for how he died, but for how he tried to live. As a pilot, as a helper, as someone who stepped up when needed. That's his legacy. That's what we should remember. We'll see you at the checkered flag. Today, it flies for a young aviator taken too soon.